Pastor Timothy, thank you for the invitation, and to all of my friends in Malaysia, it really is an honor to be with you at this leadership conference. I would rather be there face to face, enjoying worshiping with you, enjoying the food and the fellowship, but here we are via video, and it really is an honor. Pastor Timothy asked me to talk to you as leaders about how to lead long and strong, how to provide strong leadership that lasts a long time. And part of the problem with leaders is this idea of burnout, running out of energy and not finishing strong. Starting strong, finishing weak. Starting fast, finishing slow, or not finishing at all. And when I think about leading with strength and endurance, I think about an old, I want to say parable, but really a fable. Perhaps you've heard of Aesop's fables. His most famous fable was the Tortoise and the Hare. Now, Aesop was a Greek storyteller. He was a slave probably from Ethiopia in the 5th century BC. And back in the day when the storyteller was really a thing in the culture. Aesop's fable about the tortoise and the hare, it went something like this. There was this, obviously, tortoise, a turtle, and a hare. A hare is a part of the rabbit family, and the hare has longer ears than a typical rabbit and runs much faster. And when I say much faster, we're talking about 80 kilometers per hour or 50 miles per hour. That's how fast a European hare can run. And so since he was a Greek storyteller, that's probably the hare that he had in mind. Whereas a turtle, a tortoise, a land tortoise, we're talking about less than a half mile per hour, 0.45 miles per hour. So you've got a hare that can get up to 50 miles an hour, 80 kilometers per hour, and you've got a tortoise less than a half mile per hour. And so the fable goes something like this. This hare, this from the rabbit family, this long-eared, famously fast runner is bragging and expressing this self-confidence, overly confident in his speed, and also mocking the tortoise, the turtle, for being so slow, famously slow. And finally, the turtle had had enough of this, so he challenged the hare to a race. And so as the story goes, this race starts, and of course the tortoise is off almost in slow motion, so slow it looks like he's going backwards, and the hare takes off at that 50 mile per hour, 80 kilometer per hour speed, and the hare is so far ahead in the race that he looks back and can't even see the tortoise, so he decides to take a nap. And he lays down and goes into a deep sleep. I don't know how much time passed, depends on who's telling the story, but the tortoise in slow motion catches up and actually passes the hare who is sleeping. The tortoise is almost to the finish line, and all the other animals who were watching this race are cheering and screaming and cheering on this tortoise who's going so slowly but is about to cross the finish line. And the cheers woke the hare up, and he realizes that he's about to lose race, so he just takes off back to that 50 miles an hour, 80K per hour, and right to the finish line, but he doesn't make it in time. And of course, the slow tortoise wins the race against the fast hare. And the moral of the story, there are a lot of applications to the story, but the moral of the story is overconfident self-confidence isn't always a good thing, and mocking others, they may turn around and surprise you and beat you, and not giving your all the time. There were a lot of applications to the story. There were even, throughout history, times when there were political parables that were wrapped into this story for one political party or another. But for us, our idea is how to lead long and strong, how to provide strong leadership in the areas that we lead, and how to have that, not just a temporary flame out, but a leadership that lasts throughout a lifetime and beyond. How do we do that? Let's look in our Bibles at Genesis 21. It's the story of the birth of Isaac. And so what we'll see is God dealing with Abraham and Sarah and eventually with Isaac as he's being born. And I think there's some lessons to learn for leaders in terms of leading with strength and in terms of leading for the long haul, not burning out, not fouling out or getting disqualified, but continuing to lead with faith and with integrity from the start to the finish. Genesis 21, we'll begin in verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. There are a couple of little small words in this text, but they're significant. The word as, 2 times we see, he visited Sarah as he had said. The Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And then the other small word is in verse 2, at the time, at the right time. And I think the lesson of this text right here, we see 3 significant things about God that has to do with how we lead. The first one, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. I summarize that by saying God always works according to his word. As he had said, God visited as he had said. He had promised not only Abraham, but Sarah a child. And as we know the story, Abraham got impatient. He was 75 years old when he got the promise from God that he would have a son with his wife, Sarah. It was 100 years. He was 100 years old by the time Isaac was born here in this chapter. There's a 25-year waiting period. 25-year gap of believing the promise, but there were times when Abraham attempted to do God's will, but not in God's way. The result was Ishmael. But what this promise says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. God always works according to his word. We have to do God's work in God's way. We have to fulfill what God is calling us to do in the way that his word says to do it. We can't do it on our own terms. We can't take it into our own hands. The result of that is called an Ishmael, and that's never a good thing. Secondly, that second as. So the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. If God always works according to his word, number 2, God always keeps his promises. He did to Sarah as he had promised. His words are the fence line, the walls, the boundaries. His promise is the power to make it happen. If he did to Sarah as he promised, it did take 25 years. The promise, 75 years old. The fulfillment, 100 years old. 25 years holding to the promise. Sarah held it. Now, again, Abraham tried to do it in his own way, in his own power and all of that. But what do? When you have the vision, the promise, the mission of God, and it doesn't seem to be happening when you wanted to. Just remember, God always keeps his promises. And the third thing we see from this text in verse 3 is that word at. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. If God always works according to his word and God always keeps his promises, the third thought from this, God is never late. At the time he had promised. God has a timing. He not only has his word, he not only has a promise for every one of us, but he has a timetable. And he is never late in what he does. It's rarely according to our timetable. There are things that I've ended up doing in ministry as a leader that I thought it was way before the time it should have been. Maybe you found yourself in those situations where you feel like you're in over your head in terms of leadership. The leadership requires this level of knowledge and leadership wisdom and leadership strength, and you feel like you have it here. And you need about 5 more years before you're ready to do that. Welcome to ministry leadership. That's just the way it is. There are other times when we wish we were in a position now, and it's really a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years or 25 years away. But God has a timetable. He's never late. He's never early. I know it feels like to us he's often late and often early, but from his perspective, he does it at the time he promised, at the right time, exactly when we need him to come through and do it. Remember the tortoise and the hare? You know, when we think about that story in terms of the patience or the lack of patience we see in Abraham and Sarah from time to time, I think it can help inform us when we're waiting on the promises of God. One reason the tortoise could be patient and just keep plugging away is because of the lifespan, the life cycle, how long he had to get things done. In 1777, the British explorer James Cook gifted a tortoise to the Tongan royal family. And from generation to generation, for the next 180 years, that same tortoise was passed on to the next generation and the next, from 1777 to 1965 when that tortoise died. It lived 188 years. Tortoises commonly live beyond 100 years, and maybe that's why they aren't in a hurry. If we take the mentality of a tortoise, then we're probably not going to burn out as leaders. On the other hand, a hare, a European hare, typically lives 3 to 5 years. If you only have a 3 to 5 year timetable to get something done, we're not talking literally what the rabbit is going to get done, but if we apply that to us, if we think short term and it ends up being long term, we do tend to burn out. We do tend to get impatient. We do tend to take too much on and run at a full sprint. But when we take the mentality of the tortoise and realize we're in this for the long haul, none of us are going to live 188 years, but we don't have the 3 to 5 year perspective. We have the 100 year from now perspective, because it's not just us, but it's the next generation and then the next and then the next. So I think a long-term vision helps us have the patience that sometimes Abraham had, oftentimes he didn't. When we look at Abraham's life, we see that this story that we're reading, the one we're looking at here in Genesis 21, the previous chapter, we see one of his great failures. He runs into King Abimelech, and not the only time he did this, but he lied about his wife, and he said that his wife was his sister. So King Abimelech took her into his harem as one of his wives or one of his concubines or whatever. And the angel of the Lord came to this King Abimelech and basically said, "You're a dead man because you have the wife of my prophet." Now, what a horrible example of being God's prophet. He lies to the king and gives up his wife instead of protecting his wife. And so then Abimelech, who at that moment seemed more righteous than God's prophet, he goes to Abraham and says, "Hey, wait a minute, why didn't you tell me this was your wife? You said this was your sister." And so anyway, they sort that out. And what had happened in the meantime, we see at the end of chapter 20, is God had stricken the whole household of King Abimelech with barrenness. And this king asked God's prophet Abraham and says, "Hey, the angel of the Lord instructed me to ask you, I'm giving your wife back." And then he says, "You're supposed to pray for me because I've taken your wife. God's judged my household. And if you pray, God will deliver us all from barrenness." And so here Abraham prays. And suddenly, babies start popping out over the next 9 months, or at 9 months, in the household of Abimelech. And the barrenness is gone, but the irony or the twist of the story is, as you know, Abraham and Sarah have not been able to have children. It's been almost 25 years at this point. There was barrenness. And it's one of the difficulties of leadership sometimes when we see something we're struggling with, and yet we see God not only blessing others in the area we're struggling with, but He uses us to bless others in the area we're struggling with. I have no doubt that countless times Abraham prayed for his wife, crying out to God for a child, and year after year after year after decade, it was not answered. And then he goes to this king, Abimelech, and prays for their household, and suddenly the barrenness is lifted, and now he goes home to a barren wife. We see that in the end of chapter 20. It says, Abram prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech. and also healed his wife and his female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And obviously, it seems like God was doing that to make sure the barrenness hit so that there wouldn't be any confusion about what was about to happen with the birth of Isaac. There wouldn't be any confusion about who the father was. Was it Abimelech or was it Abraham? But this whole barrenness came over, and God used Abraham to lift that. Sometimes as leaders, we do have to lead out of our own pain. Sometimes as leaders, we are struggling with provision, but we're preaching faith. Sometimes it's a healing situation. We're praying for the sick, and yet people in our own family are not well. We minister not out of our strength, but out of the strength of the Lord and out of the word of the Lord. It wasn't hypocrisy for Abraham to pray for God to bless this household with babies, even though he didn't have babies of his own. I think there's sometimes we think if it's not working perfectly in our life, then as leaders, we can't talk about it, or we can't preach it, or we can't minister that to others. That's not what happened here. The very thing that Abraham was asking God for, he prayed that for others, and it was answered. But in due time, as we see in verse 2, at the time of which God had spoken, because God's never late, at that time, God did answer. And you see what happens is here Isaac is born. Now, when I think about leading strong and long, not burning out, but having the same strength and the same pace from the beginning to the middle to the end, I think there's some important lessons here. Abraham encounters King Abimelech. And instead of standing with his wife, he lies, says she's my sister. He abandons her. There's another time when famine hits and he goes to Egypt. Same thing happens. He gives up his wife. We find Isaac walking in the footsteps of his dad, and a famine hits. And I'm sure he remembered the example of his dad who went to Egypt and caused all kinds of problems. And we see Isaac going to the border of the promised land in Egypt, but he doesn't cross the border. He's tempted to, it's obvious, he's going almost there, and then perhaps at that moment he remembers what his dad did, and then he stays in the promised land. And then it says, Scripture tells us that God blessed him 100-fold, even in the midst of a famine. And so, good move there, Isaac. You saw the example, not only the good example of the generation before you, but you saw an example of where they messed up and you learned from it. Now we find Isaac. He was born in this chapter we're looking at, 21, but he grows up. And now in chapter 25, we see that the same thing that his dad was wrestling with, Isaac has promises and dreams and visions of having children, but it's not happening. What did he learn from watching, and not watching, he wasn't born yet, but hearing his parents talk about the story of God's provision and how long it took? We get to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 19. And it says, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac. And then verse 20. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel of the Aramean, etc. So it says, verse 20, Isaac was 40 years old when he got married. Verse 21, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Just like the generation before, there's a barrenness. Isaac gets married at 40. He finds out in time that his wife is barren. Verse 21, he prays to the Lord for his wife, for she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer. And his wife, Rebekah, conceived. Look at this. He gets married at 40. His wife's barren. He prays. God answers, and she has a baby. Wow. Simple, right? We look at that and go, why was this such a struggle for Abraham? You know, he gets married. He's got this promise and this dream of the next generation, but for 25 long years, his wife is barren. And eventually we see God comes through. But here we have Isaac, barren wife. He prays, verse 21, he prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And then it goes on down and it talks about the twins, not just conceived, she has twins, and it explains all this. And then we get to verse 26. Interesting. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was Jacob. Isaac, then it gives us one little sentence that doesn't seem to fit in the narrative, but look what it says. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Here's God's perspective. Isaac gets married at 40, has a barren wife, he prays, God answers, his wife has twins. Pretty simple. That's God's perspective. A day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years as a day, but then here's the human perspective. Oh yeah, verse 26, he was 60 when those babies were born. Either that was the longest pregnancy in the history of humanity, 20 years, or there was a pretty big gap between he prayed and God answered. The moment he found out his wife was barren, he prayed in verse 21. First sentence of 21, it's a prayer. Second sentence in verse 21, that prayer is answered. But in that one verse between the first sentence in verse 21 and the second sentence in verse 21, there's a 20-year gap. I think he looked at the history that he had heard about his parents, and we don't find an Ishmael being produced. We just find that he somehow held on to the promise of God for all these years. Hebrews 6:12 says, it is through faith and patience that we inherit the promises of God. Faith and patience. A lot of times when we move in faith, we want it right now, but it's the faith and the patience. I want to encourage you as leaders to move in faith, to believe God, to always be people of faith, of expectation, of hope, but to also have patience. And when we have patience, I think back to the tortoise and the hare. I think the tortoise, they live a long time. They have a long-term view. Therefore, there's a patient one foot in front of the other, moving without this rushed, hurried frenzy. Let's approach life and ministry like the tortoise, not like the hare. Let's approach it with a long-term view. When we talk about leading with strength and longevity, it's not really how fast we go right now. I was reading an article recently about a person who was sort of bragging about his church being one of the fastest growing churches in America, and I thought, oh no, don't go there. I'm not sure fast growth is a good thing. I'm not sure fast growth is something we should aspire to, something we should honor. Healthy growth, yes. Deep growth, yes. Steady growth, yes. Biblical growth, yes. Growing through evangelism, yes. Fast growth, I don't know. In my opinion, more often than not, fast growth in a church or ministry is rarely sustainable, and it's rarely healthy growth. Let's not be in a hurry. If we want to make it for the long haul, let's think long term. Let's get rid of the hurry and the frenzy and the as if we're in a race with someone. And let's run our race. Even if it looks to others like we're going as slow as a turtle, it's okay as long as there's strength and longevity, faith and patience.